Hello everyone, and welcome to the APUSH review for the 2020 DBQ. I know this has been a very interesting time for all of us, to say the least, but this week is our AP exam, and I've been struggling with exactly what kind of a review to do for everybody. I know a few have asked me to please do one on YouTube, so I am going to do one about the DBQ, obviously, because we're only taking the one element of our exam, and I'm going to go over possibilities for a DBQ as well for you. Now I want to remind you that our AP exam again is this Friday the 15th. It starts at 2 o'clock, but please remember there's some things you need to do beforehand. You want to do the exam demo on AP College Board. You want to practice submitting your responses, and remember you can do that as many times as you like, so you feel comfortable with the process. And whatever device you're going to use, be it a laptop, a desktop, iPad, tablet, a cell phone, you want to practice that and practice that and practice that until you feel comfortable with it. You want to make sure you have your checklists for each exam that you're taking, not just our exam here, the APUSH one, but for every one of them you want a checklist. You want to verify your email as well. Some students have still said they don't get all the emails, so when you go on College Board, verify that, because you're going to be emailed an e-ticket 2 days before the exam. So Wednesday, be looking for your e-ticket. Then the day of the exam, you're going to click on your e-ticket and you want to sign in 30 minutes prior to the exam. Now the exam starts immediately at 2 o'clock. So you want to sign in by 1:30 because you want to go through your checklist, and there is several verification things you have to go through before you can start your test, and that takes some time. So if you wait until 2 o'clock to sign in, you'll actually be too late. So that's why that's important. So some people keep asking, am I going to predict the DBQ this year? And I keep wondering, well, this maze of an exam that we're going through this year, how can you possibly predict a single DBQ? But what I've been doing with you, my students, and for anyone else who might watch this, is think about the 8 themes of APUSH and maybe utilize that to try to create for yourself your own type of review. Now, to remind you, our 8 themes. So here are the first 4: American and national identity. And then I give you also right here what the definition of American and national identity is. I'm not going to read it. You can pause at this moment and read this for yourself. Perhaps maybe take a sip of a nice beverage. I have iced tea. I'm going to take a few seconds here. As you know, in all my videos, I have to do that, right? Of course, theme 2 is work exchange technology. This is a lot of your economics and labor markets and things like that. Geography and the environment. We have migration and settlement, theme 4. Again, everything that's immigration, as well as moving from one part of the country to the other. And then the other 4 themes, we have politics and power, right? The rise of political parties, of political movements, and different belief systems. America and the world, those 2 are close to each other. This one focuses on the relationship with Europe and Latin America, Asia. Themes 7 and 8 are very similar, and I'm going to show you why I feel that way at the end here. You have American and regional culture and social structures. Oftentimes, they're kind of going hand in hand. But again, you can look at this. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to give you several options for a DBQ using themes. This way, you don't have to worry about, well, I know the exam covers periods 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So periods 3 through 7 is the possible target of this DBQ. But you always have to remember, if they also think of these themes, and a lot of this will overlap. American and national identity can begin in period 3, but overlap into period 4. Right? Regional culture and social structures can begin in period 4, but can actually almost overlap all the way to period 6 and 7. So thinking of that, I'm going to give you this type of review that's going to look at some very specific things, but how it can stretch over a longer period of time. Remember, you also are going to want to think about what historical thinking skill do they want you to utilize. Do you see the word change in the essay prompt? you know then this is a continuity and change essay. Do you see the word cause? Now you know this is a causation, a cause and effect essay. Do you see the word compare? So now you're going to do a comparison and a contrast essay. So those are your three historical skills that you might see. So you want to look for those key words. But, okay, thinking of that, let's move into, though, utilizing themes so we don't overwhelm too much with this. And a first thought could be African Americans, American and national identity. Right? And this could stretch over a longer period of time. Perhaps College Board this year, since they're only going to give you the one element of our test, maybe they're going to make you try to remember more than just a short period of time. Maybe they're going to look at causes over several decades, or perhaps they're going to look at a continuity and a change over multiple decades. Or maybe they're going to ask you to compare one time period to another time period that also would stretch over multiple decades. I also throw a little contextualization in here for you. Whenever you contextualize, you always want to think at least one or two specific pieces of evidence that you could use to tie into your overall essay. It's always better to think of things that come before. Now, of course, in the rubric, it will say contextualize. You can contextualize before, during, or after. But looking at that before element is always a better choice. I'm just going to let you know that. And it's always a good idea, to me, my opinion is, don't try to put it in your opening paragraph. If you put in your opening paragraph, it could be tied into your thesis, and then you wind up losing a contextualization point. Maybe your second paragraph you write could be your contextualization. You can talk about, if we're talking about African Americans, the beginning of importation of slaves in 1619, the entire Atlantic slave trade system. Sugar was the linchpin to how that worked. That's throughout the late 1600s, throughout the early 1700s. You got the concepts of race and how it's changing. Virginia creates laws to differentiate between an indentured servant to a slave. Things like that could perhaps be a good contextualization point for you. But let's start thinking overall of an identity. You get in the Revolutionary period, and I'm holding back a sneeze right now, and I don't want to start all over again. So if I sneeze like that, it's just, I'm not sick. Don't worry. This is why I'm doing this on the video, but that had nothing to do with Corona. But the air conditioning came on me, and I got hit with cold air, so it always makes me sneeze. All right, getting back to this thing. So we get this, all men are created equal, right? The Declaration of Independence. Well, this is our identity as Americans, and how we start to think of ourselves, differentiating ourselves from British identity. However, there is a hypocrisy here. There are millions of slaves in bondage. The man who wrote that, Thomas Jefferson, is a slave owner. But there were many, many slaves in America who read the Declaration of Independence, and they were highly influenced by it. Many of them will join Washington's army and fight for their freedom. There were many people after the American Revolution who even began to think about abolition of slaves. Right? As the Revolution comes to an end in 1781, in the 1780s, there were individuals who were beginning to think, well, maybe we can end slavery. But then we go into a constitutional convention to create a constitution because of the failures of the Articles of Confederation, and all of a sudden slavery comes back. Counting slaves towards population, a 3/5 compromise, counting a percentage of my slaves towards representation in the House, which also led to more electoral votes in the South. So a Southern political power begins because of this compromise of 87. You get the Great Virginia Dynasty, Jefferson, Madison, well, actually starting with Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. You get most of your presidents of the time period leading up to the Civil War are Southern presidents because of this. The few northern presidents that are there, looking at you, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, you useless men, they only were one-term presidents. However, they were put there because they were pro-slavery. There was this sense of diversified citizenship that emerges for free Africans and also for women in America. They don't get their full citizenship rights because many of them are disenfranchised. Although there are a few counties in Massachusetts and even a few counties in the South that did allow for some black suffrage because you absolutely needed people to vote for certain things. But for the most part, African Americans were denied the right to vote, even if they were free. As a westward migration begins, especially because of the Louisiana Purchase, you get this divide now in our country. North is industry, South, agrarian, slave economy. This adds a lot of friction to our identity as an American. It adds to sectionalism. We become very dug in our thought as to our state is our home, right? Many people this time period are not going to call themselves an American. If someone was to ask them, where are you from? They would say, my home is Virginia. I'm from the great state of Virginia, or I'm a New Yorker. And they would be very proud of that, more so than calling themselves an American. With a free labor market beginning, this now comes into conflict with slavery. You have an industry in the North where they have to pay their workers, but people are free to choose what job they want. That's why it's a free labor market. And there isn't one with slavery. So as everyone's going west, crossing the Mississippi River, this becomes a problem. You get your Missouri Compromise out of this. But again, instead of trying to, hey, let's figure out this idea of slavery, instead, let's try to patchwork the idea of slavery and hope that future generations can solve this problem better than we can. Even Thomas Jefferson was very afraid of this particular compromise. He said, like a fireball in the night, it had awoken him. And he knew he had a wolf by the ears that you can neither safely hold nor safely let go. Slavery is becoming to identify everything we are as Americans because of this allowing it to happen. However, a war with Mexico will also bring this up again. Sectionalism becomes even more ingrained. As the war is beginning in 1846, Wilmot Proviso, this thought of allowing free soil in any of the territories taken from Mexico. So that also begins to define us even more so. Instead of the North not necessarily embracing abolition yet, but they are still thinking of this free labor market versus the slavery. What if you bring slaves west and they industrialize, and now we have to compete economically with that? Thoughts of freedom and rights, though, are starting to grow in America. I don't have it up here, but I should have had Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, where he begins to tell us it's our right as an American to question authority. So I'll say that again since it's not here. Henry David Thoreau, his speech called Civil Disobedience, your right to question authority and question the government over slavery. He was very concerned that the Mexican War, in fact, was a slave war. An abolitionist movement is fully on us, again, trying to convince Americans that our identity is supposed to be about freedom and rights. If we believe as Americans in fundamental freedoms, fundamental rights, why do we have people in bondage? But again, instead of trying to solve this issue, we have a compromise of 1850 now. A gold rush takes place. And Americans are more still concerned about economic, they're more concerned about their own particular lives, and they're not yet ready to answer the question on freedom for all people. A Kansas-Nebraska Act happens that just infuriates the North and the South over slavery, and basically the Civil War begins in Kansas. We get Bleeding Kansas out of that. To try to help Americans understand the human plight, you get Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1850, focusing on family, how slavery truly hurts the family. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, gives a famous speech in 1852, The Meaning of the 4th of July, again pointing out to white America, these holidays you have, the hypocrisy in it. He acknowledges that the Founding Fathers were good men, but there are issues that we have to take care of. Right? How do we keep identifying ourselves as Americans, lovers of freedom, lovers of rights, and yet we allow the institution of slavery? The Dred Scott decision, a Supreme Court decision, this brings in Southern ideology. Right? Roger Taney, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, slaveholder, a believer in Herrenvolk philosophy, the idea that there's a master race of white people. He embraces the Fifth Amendment, right? The idea that the Fifth Amendment protects property. Thereby, no slave can ever try to get their freedom because they are property. In fact, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, he will rule, is unconstitutional because no state can now claim it is a free state. This now radicalizes people in the North to want to fight against this, to fight against even the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act that's part of that. And now you're getting more conflict over this. The Civil War comes. Lincoln, the great emancipator. Right? Now, there is two sides to this, obviously. One is the political aspect of emancipation, but the other one is the idea of setting up the potential amendment to end slavery. Emancipation is a war measure. Lincoln had war power. So he's trying to hurt the economy of the South. He's also trying to keep European powers from siding with the South, so he issues emancipation. He turns the war from a war about union to a war about freedom. But he's also putting into motion the mechanism, I can't think all of a sudden, the process to eventually get us to the 13th Amendment, to finally end slavery. He also then, during the war, gives his famous Gettysburg Address. Within 2 minutes, Lincoln will redefine what citizenship is. Right? The fighting for freedom, 77 years ago. He's going back to the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. We're now fighting for that cause. Men have died here. We can't let them die in vain. We're going to have a new government, one for the people, by the people, of the people. All people, white and black. I truly believe Lincoln is thinking even bigger in scope. There's immigration coming to America. Right? There are so many things that he's doing here when it comes to our identity as Americans. And becomes, basically, this is why it's become one of the greatest documents in American history, this 2-minute little speech. This leads to the Reconstruction Amendments, ending slavery, 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship rights and equal protection under the law, 15th Amendment, your voting rights. But it also brings about the failure of Reconstruction promises to African Americans. We get loopholes, right? The 13th Amendment has a massive loophole in it. Now, they weren't thinking loophole as they wrote it. In fact, if you remember, we talked about they were copying the law, the Northwest Ordinance that was written in 1787 that outlawed slavery in the old Northwest Territory. And in that old ordinance, it said, of course, except for someone who's been convicted of committing a crime. So basically, they just copied those words to create the 13th Amendment without realizing that the South then would interpret that and say, well, let's make a lot of various acts criminal. And then you get black codes. You get sharecropping. Right? You get segregation comes. Everything that was promised with the Civil War and Reconstruction begins to fall apart by the latter half of the 1800s. Right? So where is our identity as an American? Right? They're going to have to continue to fight for the next 100 years. Then Plessy v. Ferguson comes in 1896 that says you can segregate, separate but equal, becomes this ideology of the South. But by World War I, some of this is going to get broken up. There's going to be a great migration of African Americans who are going to head both north and west. Many of them are going to wind up in New York. They're going to wind up in a place called Harlem. And then a Harlem Renaissance begins in the 1920s, where all of a sudden, African American culture and identity starts to become embraced. for a short period of time. Art, poetry, and of course jazz music becomes something that, and then from that point on, there's going to be this strange relationship, right, between various cultures, cherry-picking each ideas and amalgamating in various ways. But of course, we don't get into period 8 or period 9. So here is a nice little idea of how they could perhaps ask you a DBQ covering American national identity, covering the theme of African Americans. Perhaps this could be a causation, it could be a comparison, it could be a continuity and change. Another possibility is always immigration. They haven't asked an immigration one in quite a while. Again, if I contextualize, I could go back to early American colonization. I can look at America as the great melting pot. Various European groups are coming here. We know predominantly it's English, but Swedes are coming, Germans are coming, Scot-Irish. Remember, Scot-Irish are not Irish, they're Scots people that lived in Ireland by British law. They were forced to live there. The Scot-Irish were the ones who really disliked government because of this. And the reasons they came range from economic freedom to religious freedom. Immigration always has also political importance early on. So this could also tie a little bit always into politics and power. Even America and the world, sometimes immigration falls into those categories as well, or those themes. We know at the beginning of political parties, the Federalists and Jeffersonian Republicans, or if you'd rather call them Democratic Republicans. Remember, Jefferson starts a party that becomes known as the Democratic Party by the time of Jackson. It's the same party, though, just different names. The first anti-immigrant law is the Alien Act, 1798. That's because many immigrants coming to America would rather join Jefferson's party than Hamilton's party. The Federalists seemed like monarchs. It made European immigrants come here and look at that and go, yeah, that's what the king would have. Jefferson's party seemed more democratic, more of the people. And the Federalists begin to realize they're losing votes this way. So we're in this quasi-war with France. Jeffersonians are very pro-France. So this was aimed to hurt the Jefferson Party and Thomas Jefferson specifically. And I'll be talking about this again later in another one of our slides here to get a little bit more detail about the Alien Act. But I don't want to get into too deep now, but just focus on this as a political thing. Immigration used as a political leverage against one party versus the other. By the 1840s and 50s, we're getting large numbers of immigrants, mostly the Irish and the Germans. But this gave rise to what we call nativism. Americans who felt that they were truly Native American. The expression WASP, W-A-S-P, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, comes out of this. First and foremost, you had to be white. Anglo-Saxon meant you were of English stock, and you had to be a Protestant Christian religion. So this also led to anti-Catholic movements. This led to the formation of a political party known as the Know Nothing Party, or the American Party. I believe the American Party is the actual name, but it became known as Know Nothings because they would never explain anything to any reporter because they want to keep everything a secret. I think at this time I'm going to take another sip of tea. You can always stop right now and take a sip of a cool beverage yourself. Hello, we're back again. The Civil War comes. The Civil War, the North actually encourages immigration. For one, they need bodies to fight in the army. So there will be a lot of these men, if they can at least speak a little English, will be dressed in the blue and fight in the Union Army. But remember, the Republican Party is trying to also fulfill the Henry Clay's American system. And one of the things they get done is the Homestead Act. Homesteading, right? Taking care of land, farming land. So this Homestead Act that they could never do when the South was still part of the Union because of states' rights and slavery, now with them fighting against the Union, they can pass this Homestead Act, 160 acres of land. If you could cultivate it within 5 years, you get to keep it. If not, you can either buy it cheap or give it back to the government. This encouraged migration, both from within our country, but also from without. Russians and Germans are going to come over here who are farmers and take advantage of this and go out to these Western territories, no slavery, right, to farm. Wheat farmers, corn, right? Various products are going to be now farmed out here that do not rely on slavery at all, and utilizing new technological advances of farming machinery, the reaper and the combine and that sort of stuff. So immigration was encouraged here. With the rise of industry after the Civil War, the Industrial Revolution is upon us. We get mass immigration from Eastern Europe, Italy, Greece, again, Russia, Poles are coming, Czechs are coming. Also, China is coming. Now, they're working in our industries. Massive factories are being built all over the north, and many of these immigrants are coming for those jobs. The Chinese predominantly come to help build railroads. But we talked about how the Alien Act is our first anti-immigrant law, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Another anti-immigrant act, but the only one that focused on a particular ethnic group. Interestingly, something that we don't always talk about, in 1875, the government had already passed a law against Chinese women. They didn't want Chinese women coming to America anymore because they were coming, and of course, babies were being born. So first they had an anti-Chinese women law in 1875, and then a few years later here in 1882, no more Chinese immigration whatsoever. But again, immigrants now bring up the question of citizenship, which also could tie into American identity as well. Who is a citizen? Wong Kim Ark is born here, right? Again, up until 1875, Chinese women can come to America. So he's born here. He grows up. He has a restaurant in San Francisco. His parents are very old. They want to go back to China. They want to die in their homeland. So he gets a passport. He sets sail, goes to Hong Kong. He's gone for 6 months. He comes back to the United States, and he's allowed to enter. A year later, he wants to go visit them. So he goes again. It's the second time he comes back. They bar him from entering because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And he says, I'm an American citizen. And they say, no, you're not. He says, yes, I am. No, you're not. Yes, oh man, the Supreme Court. The 14th Amendment. Anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen. Extremely controversial is the Wong Kim Ark, even to this day, for various reasons. But it establishes citizenship rights again. Now again, this could also be used easily in the other theme of American identity, but I put it here in the immigration one. Political machines, obviously as cities begin to rise, these political bosses emerge. They take advantage of immigrants. They become a major voting block for them. They force them to live in these awful tenement homes. They put them in these jobs where they really aren't going to get any basic rights, but they're afraid of these political bosses. Thomas Nast is the famous cartoonist who took on the most notorious of the political bosses, William Boss Tweed. Of course, then Jane Addams comes along. We get settlement homes trying to help immigrants. By the late 1800s, there are Americans who begin to worry about what's happening to immigrants, although the majority of Americans are in the dark, as it were, until Jacob Riis lights it up with his photo book, How the Other Half Lived, because he used flash photography in order to take these pictures. This is a photo book. This was a bestseller. It also, one of Jacob Riis's closest friends was the police commissioner of New York City, a guy named Theodore Roosevelt, who also began to take on various social causes, which is the beginning now of this progressive movement in America. By the 1900s, we are starting to see ethnic communities appear in large cities, New York, Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, right, all over America. They start to bring various cultural things that we start to embrace. So again, this could also tie into the social cultural theme. Food is always a big thing, right? When the Italians bring pizza, Americans hate it, and then we love it. Right? So a lot of food starts to become cultural, but it starts to fall into our culture. When we get into World War I, immigration is still coming to America, but because of Russia falling to the Soviet Union, a first Red Scare begins in America. We begin to fear that a lot of these Eastern Europeans are influenced by communistic, socialistic ideology. So all of a sudden, by the 1920s, we get a series of quota acts limiting the number of immigrants percentage-wise, right? Trying to stall the amount of immigrants that can come here. And because, again, we don't go into the period 8 to talk about that, that's kind of where I'll keep it there. But again, you can see this nice little thing through history. This covers multiple periods as well, but utilizing this theme. Could this be, again, a causation essay? Could it be a comparison essay? Could it be a continuity and change essay? Look for those key words to see how to best write this particular essay. Of course, work exchange technology. You know, again, we think of colonial America. We were in a mercantilist system under the British, this Atlantic system, but Americans began to smuggle. Our ideas of self-rule, all this led to even some home industry. Shipbuilding was something American did during the colonial period on their own. But this starts to put in our mind this idea of capitalism. Innovation comes, right? Eli Whitney's cotton gin, 1794. Interchangeable parts come slowly after that. Sam Slater is an immigrant who helped build our factory system. He's called the father of the American factory system. The first textile mills in America began to emerge in the 1790s. So our first market industrial revolution is going to slowly begin here. Again, the second time I mentioned Louisiana. Louisiana Purchase also invigorates this market revolution. That's in 1803 is that purchase. 1807, Robert Fulton Steamboat. So we get this transportation revolution is going to happen, which invigorates a westward migration. In order to have a westward migration, we need internal improvements, canals and roads, and all this explodes into this market revolution. Textile industry is the predominant part of it. We also can throw in here the Lowell factory girl, right? Many women for the first time are going to be able to have jobs. It's an experiment that they're doing. It didn't last very long, but at least it was their first taste of that. Entrepreneurs come, these men who take massive risk in order to build an industry. And in the South, you can never forget, cotton production is so important. The Southern cotton becomes the backbone of the United States economy, which also then brings in the conflict of slavery. We get clashes, again, over states' rights advocates versus the pro-government help. Your Henry Clays, right? Your American system is part of this. They would like the government to fund internal improvements. But states' rights, you raise a tax to build roads, you may eventually start to pass laws to limit my slavery. And again, when they got the Missouri Compromise of 1820, you can start to see why Southerners begin to actually fear that this could be true. Communication revolution is starting as well. The telegraph comes in 1844 until 1876 with the telephone. The Civil War mentions, obviously there's many times we can talk about the Civil War as a great turning point in our history. That led to mass production and the rise of the Industrial Revolution. Steel with Andrew Carnegie, oil with John D. Rockefeller. That's the rise of monopolies and trust. Social Darwinism is used to explain why these men are doing what they do, because they're the best of the best. I'm going to talk about social Darwinism later on as well. The 14th Amendment. Remember, the 14th Amendment gives you equal protection under the law. Corporations are going to use the 14th Amendment because the 14th Amendment protects people. And what makes a corporation but people? So the 14th Amendment is going to be misapplied here in order to help the rise of industry. Of course, labor movements rise up to fight against what they feel are unsafe working conditions, low pay, right? Unsanitary, just a whole bunch of things that they believe that management is doing to hurt labor. The Knights of Labor is the most famous of this labor movement group. You can also throw in the agrarian revolution. Farmers start to feel, since the crime of 73, the panic of 1873 happens, that they are in fact being hurt by industry, the railroad predominantly, and they began this whole agrarian revolution. You get Granger movements and Granger laws, which eventually fall apart because of Supreme Court cases. You get the Farmers Alliance, and then by the 1890s, they become a political party known as the Populist Party. You get another panic in 1893, and the farmers utilize that panic because of so many people out of work, right? They merge with the labor movements and try to win that election of 1896, preaching silver and gold, 16 ounces of silver to every 1 ounce of gold. That became the basis of the child's storybook, The Wizard of Oz, right? So all of that could fall into this particular thing here. During this time period, though, government is starting to become a little bit more on the side of business. They give subsidies for the first time. They're going to give land tracts of land to railroads to help build their railroads. They would have never done that with canals up here because, again, states' rights. But the Civil War ends this idea of states' rights. So government does get a little involved in business, but they do practice laissez-faire economics. They do believe that business should be business, which led to, again, this progressive movement. All right, so here we're talking about progressivism again. Progressivism, we talk about with immigrants. We also talk about industry. Progressives begin to see corruption within industry. They begin to believe government should be more reactive to protect the consumer. You get Theodore Roosevelt, his 3 C's. Consumer protection, corralling the corporations, and conservation of the environment. All right. Woodrow Wilson, he's the Democratic president. Theodore Roosevelt is Republican. Woodrow Wilson is Democrat. We get the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1913, right? Making government more responsive to what industry is doing. We call this regulation on industry begins to happen because of the progressives. Of course, let's talk about, again, the innovators. You couldn't have the explosion of industry without innovation. Thomas Edison, even though he did not invent a light bulb, he does help innovate it and make it more practical. Oh, we skipped the Wright brothers. 1903 is their first flight to Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. Of course, that's going to just make the transportation revolution just take flight. Yeah, that's a bad joke. Henry Ford's assembly line. This scientific method is applied to industry. You know, everyone works this big line and everyone has one job to do. Your job is just taking spokes and put them into wheels. Spokes into wheels. The other guy's job is to take the wheels and put it on the frame of a car. And the other guy's job is to take the frame of the car and then apply an engine to it. Another guy's job is now you got a frame with wheels and an engine. We'll put doors on, and so on down the assembly line. Everyone has that one job to do. World War I brings about more mass production, which eventually leads to this roaring 20s. And everybody wants to get in on industry, and so they start buying stock, which led to the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression of the 1930s. So again, here is this 100-year, right, thing you can look at here with work exchange technology. Again, this could be a causation, a comparison, or continuity and change. Politics and power, right? Looking at this as political parties. The Articles of Confederation, you have one Congress, one vote, or one House Congress. Each state has one vote, which led to a Constitutional Convention to get a 2-House Congress. Now we were trying to figure out what we're going to do with our government. The Federalist Papers come along and begin to explain what the Constitution is going to do. And Federalist number 10 specifically talks about factions, groups of men who want to influence people for their own gain, and how to deal with that. Unfortunately, they never dealt with it properly because it does lead to the rise of political parties. In the 1790s, you get Hamilton on one side, loose construction, loosely interpreting the Constitution. He's pro-manufacturing, pro-English, pro-central government. He wants assume all the Revolutionary War debt of the states into the national debt. and he wants a Bank of the United States to oversee the economy. This put him in opposition with Thomas Jefferson, who believes in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. He's agrarian or farming rights. He's pro-France. He's pro-French. He's a states' writer. This is what clashes and gives rise to political parties. These two men cannot play nice. George Washington's farewell address, he tries to warn the country about political parties. Why political parties is not what an American should be. So again, American and national identity. George Washington's address could go there. What is truly an American? It is our spirit. He talks about to think in terms of American. Unfortunately, that didn't work. People began to think regional. People began to think just their part of the country, and political parties was what was going to help them do that. Again, here we go with John Adams, XYZ affair, alien sedition. So I told you to mention alien sedition acts again. They're trying to hurt each other's party. John Adams is a Federalist, the only Federalist president we ever have. He wants to basically crush the Jeffersonian Republicans. Alien Act was trying to take away their voting power of immigrants. Sedition, don't let them talk against the government because we're in a quasi-war with France. That led Jefferson and Madison to counter alien sedition acts with Virginia-Kentucky resolutions. And they brought in this theory of compact theory, that the 13 original states came into an agreement, a compact, to form the Constitution. Thereby, states are superior to the federal government, states' rights. That never passes. It's only a resolution, but it sets the seed for further conflict with these political parties. We get into the early 1800s. Basically, the Federalists begin to fall apart, and these Jeffersonian Republicans, or Democratic Republicans if you like, begin to destroy everything that was Hamiltonian economy until the War of 1812 happens. The War of 1812, Madison, who is a Jeffersonian Republican, begins to embrace certain parts of Hamilton. Let's bring back a bank, because we couldn't finance the war. Let's build internal improvements, because we couldn't move our army during this war. And since we have industry, because the war helps create textile industries, iron-making industries, we need to protect them from the British market. Let's get a protective tariff. Hamilton, Hamilton, Hamilton. This gave way to the American system, which again is going to pull these parties apart. That Jefferson Party gets split. You get Democratic Republicans and National Republicans. And then that creates two new basic parties. Although the Democrats are the true heirs of Jefferson. Their leader becomes Andrew Jackson. The National Republicans become the Whigs with Henry Clay. But again, they're fighting over these Hamiltonian ideas. The second Bank of the United States. This American system, building internal improvements and protective tariffs. There's a rise of party patronage is happening, giving people political favors if you're helping individuals win elections. States' rights becomes the center of the Democratic Party. Agrarian ideas, slavery, all that is imbued within the Democratic Party. But as you get this westward migration, it comes in conflict with Northern ideology. This nullification crisis happens when Jackson is president. Now the Vice President, John C. Calhoun, brings back Jefferson's compact theory. But instead of just saying that the states are superior to the federal government, now he starts talking about secession. A state can leave the Union if they're angry enough. Further alienating these political parties. Further creating within this country people choosing sides. And no one really thinking in terms of American, but thinking only in terms of their party and their state. The Mexican War comes, which actually increases sectionalism. Many saw this as a slave war, that the South wants to extend slavery to California. We talked about that Wilmot Proviso in the other slide. That could come here as well. The Compromise of 1850, trying to patch up things between the political parties over slavery. But eventually the Whig Party falls apart and a new Republican, the modern Republican Party, comes around. It should also be noted that the Democrats are embracing the philosophy of popular sovereignty. They're trying to say, okay, when it comes to slavery and the Western territories, let the people out west choose for themselves. Let them vote. Do they want their territory to be a slave state? Do they want their territory to be a free state? The Democrats believe this will save the American system, or not the American system, our country, and it'll save their political party, and it leads to civil war. We get the Civil War again. See how that keeps becoming. That's a major turning point, obviously, in our history. You can use that for almost any of these essays. The Republican Party obviously comes to dominate during the war because most of the Democrats were in the South, so they became the Confederacy. The Democrats in the North become a lesser party, but they will support the Union. After the war, Republicans, you had the radical Republicans who were all about abolition and freeing the slaves, and we got those 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. But after the war, during Reconstruction and afterwards, Republicans start to focus mainly on industry, and they give up on civil rights. That's led to the failures of the Reconstruction era. The Democrats regain the South with the Compromise of 1877. You had this election in 1876, where the Democratic president nominee actually won the popular vote. But the Republican nominee, Rutherford B. Hayes, he had a little bit more electoral college. So instead of allowing this to go to the House like it's supposed to, they formed a committee of mostly Republicans with a couple of Democrats, and they told the Democrats, we'll officially end Reconstruction, give the South back to the Democratic Party if you allow our Republican, Rutherford B. Hayes, to be president. And that became the Compromise of 1877. Some people call it the Krupp Bargain Part 2. And Democrats got home rule again, which they now begin to focus more and more on segregation. Here comes progressivism again. As a social movement, both Republicans and Democrats will embrace certain aspects of this movement. Theodore Roosevelt, again, is the Republican, right? And of course, we know he has his 3 C's. He becomes very progressive. But then Woodrow Wilson basically changes Democrats into what is today this progressive liberal party. Southern Democrats, though, are always going to oppose various aspects of progressivism, especially when it comes to race, right? So progressives failed when it came to segregation. They're trying to keep their political party together, but they failed on this. Even when it came to the 19th Amendment with women to vote, when Woodrow Wilson put that out to Congress to vote on it, Southern Democrats would not support women voting rights because it would allow more black votes. This would allow black women to vote, so it would allow more black vote. It was the Republican Party that really came to Woodrow Wilson's aid and helped pass that 19th Amendment. So you do have this split in the Democratic Party. Of course, FDR's New Deal, Democrat, reinvigorates progressive liberalism change in America because, again, of the Great Depression that happens. So here's, again, a little something about political parties for you. Continuity and change, cause, effect, compare, contrast. And it could be an essay that covers only part of this time period, or it could be an essay that's overreaching. I have this feeling, again, since it's just this one element, that they might ask you to think of a longer period of time this time. That's just a hunch. And here's my last thing. So I took American and regional culture and I tied it with social structures because they kind of go hand in hand. Good contextualization for anything about our culture or our social structure, because you can always go 50 to 100 years in the past when it comes to American history. You can look at the Puritans, their model of Christian charity, the desire to, we should all work together, toil together, suffer together, right? That was their model of Christian charity, which led to this idea of, people should help people. They also created town meetings, which led to participatory democracy. This first Great Awakening happens in the early 1700s, the first moment where we could question authority. We want to make the world a better place, the Great Awakening. And also the European movement known as the Enlightenment. All this could be good contextualization for social movements or even culture. The American Revolution increased our awareness of inequalities in society. There were even abolition movements that began in the 1780s and 1790s. Greater political democracy is desired, right? Again, because that Puritan town meeting idea, the rise of Republican motherhood, getting women more involved, but they're still not enfranchised. They still don't have the vote. And the Republican motherhood, unfortunately, morphs into this cult of domesticity, that women should only be home raising children. The War of 1812 comes, and a regional and national culture begins. In art, we get the Hudson River School. These are the landscape artists who believed that painting nature was much more beautiful than to paint a portrait. In literature, we get our first American writers, Washington Irving, who wrote Sleepy Hollow. James Fenimore Cooper, The Last of the Mohegans. These are American writers. Racial attitudes are also part of our culture. Herrenvolk philosophy comes, and the South begins to defend slavery as a social positive good. We gave them Christianity. We gave them a good place to live. We feed them well, right? This racist ideology that develops amongst them. The market revolution. A slow development of a middle class begins. That's part of our culture, this idea that we all aspire to the middle class. Right? We would love to be millionaire billionaires, but we at least want to be, have that house with a family, the white picket fence. That's the aspirations, that's the American dream of the middle class, where most Americans aspire to be. That's part of who we are, socially, culturally. We also begin to demand, again, more democracy. So the mass democracy begins at this time period. All white men can vote now. Right? They get rid of land ownership. They get rid of membership in a church with a requirement to vote. They get rid of all of that. Now it opens the door to all men being able to vote, all white men. Americans begin to demand better living conditions. This all gives rise to a second great awakening. Protestant religious revivals, feeling that we were losing ourselves to economy. We're losing ourselves to only dreaming about what we can have materially and forgetting what we needed spiritually. This also led rise to that anti-Catholic movements again, because this was a Protestant movement, right? So you could throw in that little bit of immigration in here as well. Women begin to participate more and more in our society through various social reforms, temperance, education reform, prison and asylum. Of course, they were the backbone of an abolitionist movement, which led to their own suffrage movement at Seneca Falls in 1848. Some of our important leaders of abolition, William Lloyd Garrison was a white minister. He's the one that said, I want immediate emancipation now. I will not equivocate, and I will be heard. Frederick Douglass, we talked about, Meeting of the Fourth, and David Walker, also a former slave, who wrote the pamphlet, a protest to the colored citizens of the world, where he talked about more of a revolutionary approach to ending slavery. An appeal to the colored citizens of the world is what that was called. With the rise of industry in the Civil War, again, this would be social. This is culture. We're starting to think differently about women. Women in the 1780s, 1790s, they're beginning to enter the workforce, mostly in clerical work. And it's becoming acceptable at this time. We are changing our ideas of work when it comes to women. With the advent of the typewriter, the switchboard operator, those things open up thousands of jobs for women. More and more women went to colleges at this time period. Talking about philosophy and culture, I mentioned social Darwinism earlier. This idea of survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest is a philosophy. It was not developed by Charles Darwin. Herbert Spencer, an Irish philosopher, came up with this idea that if there's evolution, then there's obviously those who are better than other people. And the white race, this ties into your world history thought of white man's burden, that the white race emerged better. And within the white race, there's even people better. And that's your Carnegies and your Rockefellers. Although Carnegie will write an essay called Gospel of Wealth. Gospel of Wealth does embrace social Darwinism, but it also embraces what we call philanthropy. A rich person has an obligation to society to help people still. That's why he will build schools and libraries, concert halls. All right? He wants to try to better society. The social gospel is a religious movement that ties communism and socialism into Jesus and his Sermon on the Mount. So they kind of took political ideology and they tied it in with Christianity. Progressivism. You can't talk about social movements without progressivism again. Look at that. 1900, 1920, but again, elements begin in the late 1800s. Mostly middle-class reformers. Here we get. See how this ties in nicely up here, where we talked about the middle class is beginning. Well, the middle class, they want to hold on to everything they've got. So that's why it's mostly a middle-class reformer by the late 1800s into the 1900s. They see multiple elements of society as being corrupt. Political bosses and what they do, corporations, how they feel they hurt consumers. Again, here's Jane Addams and Jacob Riis again. These journalists come, known as muckrakers. These are writers, these are journalists who begin to report on this and expose corruption in society. Ida Tarbell took on Standard Oil. David G. Phillips wrote a series of articles called The Crime of the Senate. Progressives also want economic equality for people. They want to expand democracy. So again, that's why this would tie in nicely up here as a contextualization point. And here they are now, several hundred years later, we're still wanting to expand democracy to the people. That old Puritan thing. I always tell my students, Puritans never leave us. They want to break the power of the political bosses. Then we get these progressive amendments, the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th. Income tax is the 16th. Electing senators. Senators were not elected prior to the 17th Amendment. They were appointed. That led to a lot of corruption. 18th Amendment is prohibition. And the 19th Amendment is suffrage for women, which, by the way, this August is the 100th anniversary of that. Of course, the Great Depression eventually hits in the 1930s, which leads to this massive progressivism of the 1930s known as the New Deal, FDR's 3 R's, right? Reform, relief, recovery. Brings about changes in our society and our government. Social Security has been with us ever since. We culturally depend on Social Security. As a society, we want government to give us things from time to time. No matter how conservative you are, people still like it if the government gives some safety net. There should be some responsibility to that, is what some people argue, and that's a legitimate argument. But again, this all begins to change our society. So again, here you can look and see this development over a period of time and various elements. And again, this covers multiple periods. So instead of trying to worry about that, go back through those 8 themes, and I've been having my students create 8 separate sheets of paper and then start writing in there things that they could talk about if this was the theme. And you'll be able to tell very quickly what theme this is. They'll put something in there, you go, oh, this is definitely something political. Oh, this is definitely something about immigrants. This is definitely something about social. And that way you can have your one review sheet with you that you can really utilize then to really write this essay. Now, of course, I don't have anything here on how you would use documents as evidence or documents as sourcing. Hopefully you're practicing that. I just didn't want to make this 5 hours long. So with that, I'm going to say goodbye, and I wish everybody well for this coming Friday, May 15th. Bye-bye, everybody.